Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we have a crucial and timely topic to discuss: Canada's ongoing housing crisis. But instead of merely pointing out the problems, we're going to explore how we might learn from one of the world's most successful housing models, Singapore, to come up with some real solutions. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the housing crisis in Canada is very real and affecting millions of lives. It's not just a headline, it's a daily reality. In major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, we're seeing home prices that are nothing short of astronomical. According to a report from the Urban Reform Institute and Frontier Centre for Public Policy, Toronto was ranked the 6th most unaffordable out of 92 major metropolitan markets worldwide. Vancouver is not far behind. But it's not just about being able to buy a home, it's also about being able to afford rent. Rental shortages are pushing people out of cities, leading to less diversity, less opportunity, and less community cohesion. So, the situation is dire, but it's not hopeless. Countries around the world are tackling their housing crises in innovative ways, and we have a lot to learn from them. Singapore, for example, has dealt with its land and housing issues so effectively that 80% of its citizens live in government-built residential units. And mind you, this is in a country with far less land to work with than Canada. So, if you're as intrigued as I am to dig deeper and explore how Canada can borrow some wisdom from Singapore's playbook, stick around. We're going to delve into the specifics of both the Canadian and Singaporean housing models to understand what can be realistically adopted or adapted to make housing more affordable and accessible for Canadians. Now that we've set the stage, let's dive into the specifics of the Canadian housing crisis to better understand what we're up against. Over the last 2 decades, house prices in Canada have jumped a staggering 380%. That's no small change. But why is this happening? The root of the problem can be traced back to the global financial crisis in 2008. While the U.S. housing market collapsed, the Bank of Canada lowered interest rates to stimulate the economy. This gave a lot of Canadians the ability to buy houses they otherwise couldn't afford. Aside from low interest rates, another major contributing factor has been foreign investment. Major Canadian cities have become investment hotspots for wealthy investors from all around the world, particularly Asia. They've bought and then rent out these properties without even setting foot in them. These homes become safe deposit boxes for their foreign wealth. Moreover, Canada has some of the most lenient regulations surrounding real estate transactions. It's so easy to buy a home under a numbered corporation that you don't even have to reveal who owns it. This has also attracted a lot of suspicious cash flow into the real estate market, which authorities have conveniently overlooked. Now, let's talk about domestic investors. Real estate has provided better returns than many other forms of investment in Canada. So what did Canadians do? They started buying second and third homes as investment, further boosting house prices. But here's where things get weird. Despite Canada's vast land area, we are experiencing a housing supply shortage. We have the lowest supply of housing relative to population among all G7 countries. To match the average housing supply in countries like the US or Britain, Canada would need to build an additional nearly 2 million homes. That's huge for a country of just 40 million people. Adding to this, development charges, or taxes imposed by municipalities on new homes, have skyrocketed. For instance, in Toronto, a new single-family home comes with a developer fee of nearly $140,000. With rising taxes and costs, it's no surprise that the supply of new homes has dwindled. Last but not least, let's talk about the role of COVID-19. The pandemic led to an initial freeze in the economy. Yet, the Bank of Canada's response was to again lower interest rates and start buying mortgages off lenders, flooding the market with cheap money. This has led to a surge in prices during the pandemic years by 50% or more in many Canadian cities. It's clear that we've got a multifaceted problem on our hands. But instead of losing hope, let's look at how another nation managed to turn its housing market into a success story. Singapore's housing model is not just an example, it's proof that a country can build a robust, equitable, and sustainable housing system even when the odds are stacked against them. Switching gears, let's fly over to Singapore, a small island nation that transformed its housing crisis into one of the most successful public housing systems in the world. Yes, in the world. Given Canada's abundance of land, one might assume solving our housing problem would be simpler than in land-scarce Singapore. But let's see how they did it. Before achieving its miracle, Singapore had its fair share of housing issues: overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and squatter settlements. These issues were aggravated by fires and natural disasters that left thousands homeless. Enter the Housing and Development Board, or HDB, established in 1960 to aggressively tackle these challenges head-on. HDB was granted broad sweeping powers through various legislative means and worked on a two-pronged approach: first, constructing as many housing units as possible, and second, acquiring land to build these units. Some of their early constructions were bare-bones single-room flats designed to provide immediate relief to the homeless. There are a few key policies that made a difference. Number 1. Government land acquisition. The Land Acquisition Act of 1966 allowed Singapore to acquire private land for public utilities and residential buildings, often at below-market prices. By 2005, the government owned 90% of the land, up from just 44% in 1960. Number 2. Centralized planning and construction. HDB controlled all aspects of housing, from planning to construction, ensuring a standardized and efficient process. Number 3. Home ownership scheme. Introduced in 1964, this policy turned tenants into homeowners. It's more than just a housing policy, it's a nation-building exercise. Number 4. Social Savings Fund. The Central Provident Fund is a mandatory social savings scheme that allows Singaporeans to use their savings for buying homes, among other things. Number 5. Ethnic quotas. To foster racial integration and social cohesion, HDB flats have ethnic quotas. This ensures that each housing block and neighborhood has a balanced mix of ethnic groups, thereby promoting social harmony. Singapore's housing policy is not just about putting roofs over heads, it's about shaping a society. By mixing different-sized flats and adhering to ethnic quotas, Singapore ensures both economic and racial diversity in its public housing. The policy is so successful that 82% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats, and around 90% of them own the homes they live in. There you have it, the Singapore model in all its glory. It wasn't an overnight fix, nor was it without its controversies. Yet, it's a model that has stood the test of time, delivering on its promise of affordable and quality housing for all. Now, before we dive into how Canada can learn from Singapore, let's address an obvious contrast: land. Singapore is only about 720 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, the city of Toronto alone spans around 630 square kilometers. Yes, Singapore is barely larger than a single Canadian city. In Singapore, every inch of land comes at a premium. This scarcity pushed the government to get creative, like reclaiming land from the sea. Approximately 1/5 of today's Singapore is reclaimed land, including famous areas like Marina Bay. Singapore had to think vertically, creating high-rise, high-density public housing units to accommodate its growing population. With land this scarce, Singapore faced an uphill battle. Yet, they succeeded. The HDB didn't just build houses, they built communities. They maximized limited space through well-planned neighborhoods with amenities like schools, grocery stores, hospitals, and public transit integrated right in. Their unique approach to social engineering, through measures like ethnic quotas and strategic flat sizing, made these high-density areas not just tolerable but desirable places to live. So, despite a far more challenging landscape, literally, Singapore managed to solve its housing crisis, while providing high-quality living for its residents. The land-rich expanse of Canada should, theoretically, make solving our housing crisis easier compared to Singapore. Yet, here we are. The difference lies not just in policy but in execution, societal buy-in, and the political will to act decisively. As we've seen, Singapore's housing story is nothing short of miraculous, particularly given the obstacles they faced. So, how can Canada, with its own unique set of challenges and advantages, learn from Singapore? Here are some avenues for thought. The HDB's success comes from centralized planning and decisive action. In Canada, housing policies can differ significantly between provinces and even municipalities. A unified, focused approach could be a game changer. So, should Canada consider setting up a centralized body like Singapore's HDB? Such an entity could standardize housing policies, ensure quicker decision-making, and possibly even regulate prices to keep homes affordable. Canada, unlike Singapore, has land in abundance. But are we using it effectively? Provincial governments could potentially learn from Singapore's aggressive land acquisition and reclamation strategies to develop underutilized areas for housing. By employing a focused strategy for land use, we could dramatically increase the supply of affordable housing, especially near urban centers where demand is highest. Singapore's mandated social savings fund, where both employee and employer contribute, is an interesting model. The fund serves multiple purposes but is widely used to finance home buying. In Canada, registered retirement savings plans, RRSPs, can already be used for home purchases, but the mechanism is not as robust or as directed as Singapore's system. A more targeted savings fund could make home ownership accessible for more Canadians, especially younger adults struggling to enter the housing market. Singapore's community-centric planning model is another big win. Self-contained, well-planned communities mean people have most of what they need right where they live. Canada's current approach to urban development often prioritizes individual projects over cohesive community planning. Taking a page out of Singapore's playbook to create self-contained communities could offer residents not just a place to live, but a better quality of life. So there you have it. The Canadian housing crisis is not just a challenge, it's an opportunity to innovate, to improve, and perhaps to borrow a little wisdom from a tiny island nation that turned its housing market around against all odds. In a country as resource-rich as Canada, making housing affordable might be less about reinventing the wheel and more about applying proven models in innovative ways. As much as we can admire Singapore's approach, it's crucial to consider some significant criticisms and limitations when thinking about applying similar policies in Canada. Singapore's success with its public housing largely comes from its autocratic form of governance. Decisions are made swiftly and implemented with little to no public resistance. While this facilitates smooth project executions, the same methodology may not work in Canada's democratic setting. In Canada, public consultations, environmental assessments, and negotiations with Indigenous communities are critical steps in any major land development project. These processes add layers of complexity and time but are considered essential for ethical and sustainable development. Another critical factor is the cultural and social difference between the two nations. Singapore's policies, such as social savings funds or racial quotas, might face significant public resistance in Canada. For instance, racial quotas could be viewed as discriminatory or problematic within the Canadian context, given its emphasis on multiculturalism and social freedom. Similarly, a forced social savings fund might not sit well in a society that values economic freedom. Canadians might prefer policies that allow for more individual choice rather than mandatory saving schemes. So there we have it, folks. As we've delved into today, Canada's housing crisis is complicated and multifaceted. There's no magic bullet to solve it overnight. However, Singapore's remarkable success in providing affordable housing to its citizens offers a valuable lesson. While the two countries are vastly different in many ways, the core principles of good governance, thoughtful planning, and a focus on social welfare are universally applicable. It's crucial to understand that Singapore's model isn't a one-size-fits-all solution that we can copy and paste into Canada's legal and social framework. But what we can do is adapt some of the underlying principles and strategies. For example, we could consider more effective land use, explore financial schemes that incentivize home ownership without encouraging speculation, and perhaps even venture into centralized planning for public housing on a provincial or national level. Yes, Singapore had the challenge of land scarcity, which Canada doesn't face. But it also shows that even with such constraints, effective policies can lead to successful outcomes. Therefore, Canada, with its vast land, should, in theory, find it easier to solve its housing crisis, provided there's the political will and innovative planning to do so. So, while we may not see HDB flats sprouting up from Vancouver to Toronto, what we could see are more community-centric approaches, creative financial solutions, and perhaps even a greater role for government in housing, all inspired by a tiny Southeast Asian nation that dared to think differently. Thank you for joining us in this exploration. If you think Canada could learn something from Singapore, or if you have other ideas for tackling the housing crisis, let's get the conversation started. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more discussions like this one. Until next time, take care.